Welcome, everyone. Oh my goodness, and I'm getting a thumbs up and I'm seeing people smiling at me. This is awesome. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session on the fluidity of trust. I will tell you right now that compared to probably the last session, this is far less technical and much more of a philosophical, perhaps, discussion and a real look at the implications of trust in the identity industry and specifically in identity solutions. So let me kind of talk to you about a couple things here and then we'll introduce ourselves. Trust is fluid, hence the name of our session, because it's relational, because it is contextual, so it's based on context as well as relationships, and it also evolves over time. And these are probably, I'm back. And these are probably things that seem like very much common sense, and we want to talk about the application it has to the work we do in identity. Trust learns, trust adapts, and we would say that trust grows. And we want to talk about that a little bit, and we hope that at the end we will have some time for questions. And we're going to kind of talk through our relationship that we have actually professionally, business-wise together, and also the relationship that we have in this area. So let me introduce myself. I am Kay Chopard. I'm the executive director of the Kantara Initiative, and some of you clearly already know about Kantara. Let me just say a couple things. Kantara is a nonprofit membership organization, and it's really divided into two sort of halves. One is where the members are very engaged in work groups, very focused on some very specific topics, on standards, on cutting-edge issues. I think they seem a lot like a think tank. I'm relatively new. I have not been there quite a year yet, but some incredibly bright people who've really put together a lot of things. We publish white papers and so on, but also inform standards bodies and other things. On the other half, we have our assurance program, where we do certifications for technology solutions in the US that meet the NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technology, Standards 863 regarding identity proofing. And in the UK, we also run a certification program which certifies, and both of these grant trust marks against the UK Digital Identity and Attributes Trust Framework. So those are sort of the halves of Kantara, and I will let.
Yep, and I'm Wes Turbeville. I'm the Vice President of Federal at IDME. So what that means is I lead our service and support to our 10 federal partners. And for those of you who aren't familiar with who IDME is, we're a credential service provider to 90 million Americans, 10 federal agencies, 30 states, and around 530 private sector companies. Not everybody in our member base has a NIST credential, but about a third, so 30 million or so of our members have NIST credentials issued under the auspices of Kantara and NIST.
Okay, so that's who we are. Again, I just kind of wanted to give you this overview because trust, I would argue, is really the underpinning of everything that Kantara does. And it's really the foundation for everything that we do and everything that we're able to accomplish. So our trust mark, we do third-party assessments, right? Again, against, in the US, NIST 863. We also do an evaluation and approval. We have an assurance review board. These are all impartial, specially accredited bodies with very specialized expertise. And then we issue these trust marks on a 3-year cycle. And well, obviously the name, trust mark, it has trust embedded in it, but we would really argue that this fluidity of trust that we want to talk about is the underpinning for all of those things.
And as Kay mentioned, we've had a relationship with Kantara since 2014. And what started with us participating together in some Pilots in Motion Day under the Obama-Biden administration's National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace has evolved really into an 8-year trust-based partnership. So shortly after the pilots in 2014, Kantara granted us our first trust mark at the LOA 3 level. In August of 2018, we became the first organization that Kantara found to be conformant with NIST 863.3 at the IAL2 level. And then we also recently, in March of this year, passed our triennial review for LOA3 and IAL2, AAL2. So essentially, there's with Kantara, there's a 3-year cycle for big reviews, and then there's annual reviews along the way. But in the midst of the development of this relationship and our triennial review this March, there was also a pretty well-known public discourse about our use of selfies in order to adhere to some of the standards that are in NIST 800-63-3. So for those of you who aren't familiar, in order to issue a credential at IAL2 according to the 63.3, you've either got to do physical or biometric comparison of the claimant to the strongest piece of evidence. And NIST calls for biometric comparison in instances of remote proofing, which is a majority of what IDME does. And the examples it gives in the 63B are either face, iris, or fingerprints. But obviously, the use of face is the one that's got the most ubiquitous technology and consumer-friendly technology that's out in the market today. So in our experience, what we found is that most government agencies want to stay close to those NIST credentials, either through their own individual risk assessments or because of the directives that are out there, such as OMBM 1917. But as you move out of the public sector and into the commercial sector and private sector, where a lot of your organizations are today, what you see is there's more flexibility in terms of the policies that are implemented. So out in the commercial sector, we do implement policies that don't involve selfies. These include KBA replacement and what we call fortified identity, which has different levels of proof, but doesn't necessarily involve a selfie. And so through that experience, this journey with Kantara and then also our experience in the private sector, we've certainly learned a lot of lessons and have a lot of insights about what matters to the users and then also to the relying parties that they trust.
Before we go to the next slide, and I know you're going to talk. So I did another session about Kantara, and I was asked to please explain some of the acronyms that we keep using. So in case there's anyone who doesn't know what some of these things are, the IAL2 that you see on that very bottom bullet, that's Identity Assurance Level 2. So the NIST 863 is divided into 3 sections, A, B, C. A is Identity Assurance. B is Authentication Assurance, hence the AAL. That's Authentication Assurance Level 2. And then C is Federation Assurance, which is not included in what IDME has for a trust mark. So in case there are some who didn't know what all that was, now you know how NIST has it separated out, and that's how our trust marks are also based. So now, sorry.
So how does the digital identity ecosystem build and retain trust over time? And I know this is a pretty straightforward answer, but we'll go in detail on the next slide. Importantly, we learn and we grow together. So I think what Kay and I are going to do next is just take you through some of the learnings and then some of the actions that players in the space can take in order to promote trust going forward.
So the first couple of bullets I have here are under the learnings. So when this first, obviously these have not been around for ages, but that said, in the federal government, there are some gaps that currently exist in the governance, if you will, of this industry. So for one, OMB, Office of Management and Budget, which is out of the White House, right, has issued a specific order, M1917, which basically calls for GSA to keep a list of approved credential service providers, CSPs. At the same time, back when Kantara created this assurance program, long before my time, I know, but they actually worked with a federal agency known as FICAM, and I don't know what FICAM stands for, so I'm not even going to attempt it. Someone else in the audience can probably help me later. TFS, that's really where they work together with the federal government. What you should know is that FICAM no longer exists, right? And while 1917 says that GSA, the General Services Administration, is supposed to keep this list, instead what they do is they allow Kantara to keep the list, which is publicly posted on our website. Every company that's gotten a trust mark and exactly what they've gotten it for is published on our website. And what GSA does is they say, go look at Kantara's website. And now we've started working in the healthcare industry, and now I have HHS, Health and Human Services, saying the same thing. Just go look at Kantara's website. We don't have to post it. They do. And the point of that, I guess, is to say that the role of sort of that arbiter of trust, which is what I would argue is what this kind of assurance program is about, that role has maybe changed over time, but it's not gone away. And what Kantara has done is continued a partnership and yet taken over leadership. And what happens, remember when I talked about it's relational, it's contextual, it evolves over time? In many ways, what you're seeing is this evolution of that relationship and that level of trust where the industry, including federal agencies, including reliant parties, know that they can trust to look at what Kantara is publicizing, trust that they are actually executing on those standards and maintaining them.
Yeah. And a couple of other lessons. One, I think we as an ecosystem lack standardized metrics and a common language about talking about tough topics that are top of mind. So performance, pass rates, equity and access. These are words that are really important to us as an ecosystem, but I think if you were to ask all of the credential service providers or identity solutions in the room, we would all talk about it in a slightly different way. So how do we actually move to a common language that we can use to collect data, to have aligned conversations, and make deliberate decisions about the platforms? I think another one that we learned that has been very important to us at IDME is that there is some mistrust of algorithm-only solutions. And so one of the things that we take to heart at IDME is the fact that we combine best-in-breed algorithms with what we call human-powered relief valves. So the way I like to think about it is that an algorithm can say yes, or an algorithm can say maybe, but it's really only a human that could say no if somebody's going through the credentialing process. And so having that final decision rest on the shoulders of a human versus an algorithm is something that is important to IDME. And then I think the third big lesson that we've learned is actually one about choice and how much consumers value choice, not just in terms of whom they trust, but then also in how they verify. And so we've done some research with a big three consulting firm, some consumer research, where we essentially asked them who they trust. And the results were to be honest with you, kind of unhelpful. So what we found is that around a quarter of the survey respondents who are Americans trust the government to keep their personal information safe and secure online. A roughly equal number, so about a quarter, trusted the private sector to do it. And then the remaining 50% either didn't know who to trust or didn't trust anyone. And so when we looked back at that data and said, okay, well, what do we actually make of this? What that tells us is important is offering choice and allowing people to choose whom they trust. I think the other big learning we had about choice was that how people verify matters. And so one of the things that we did in terms of a product innovation this spring to address some of the feedback that we've been hearing is you give users the choice of how they verify. So now our partners can give the user the option of when they start the verification process, they can either go through a self-serve process, which requires a selfie, and if that doesn't work, they'll be routed to a trusted referee or a video agent. Or if they'd like to, they can go direct to a video agent without having to submit a selfie. And so this has been something that's very powerful that we think for having people to increase their participation and puts the user in control over how they verify. So from those learnings, and I think Kay and I have just hit the highlights of what we've been learning, and we do want to spend some time answering any questions that you all might have at the end. But what we want to do is just pose to the group 4 questions that we think are really important for the ecosystem. And if we're not thinking about it today, we should go back to our organizations and think about what our answer to these questions would be if we were asked. And to me, the first one is, how do we better educate consumers about how identity verification protects them, and then also the trade-offs between different models. So in terms of protection, Identity Theft Resource Center is doing some amazing work in helping people understand what it takes to protect themselves, and then also what to do if they are a victim of identity theft. And I think those of you who sat through the brief yesterday saw some pretty staggering statistics from ITRC. And the second one is the trade-off between models. There are models where the evidence is provided by the user going through the process. There are models where profiles are built passively on users in the background. And each one has its pros and cons, and I think it's important for the users to understand what those pros and cons might be, and also for the agencies to understand what type of solution is going to work best for them.
So the second question that you see that we have posed, and we don't have to focus on these questions, but in our little Q&A section when we're done here, but we felt like these were really important things to consider. So the other one is, and some of this is much more related to Kantara and the thought leadership there, is when, how do we ensure that concerns that are raised, issues, problems, whatever, to specific organizations, that they are best positioned to address those? In other words, if an entity of any kind is facing criticism for following the standard, which is a conundrum for Kantara, right? Because we're certifying that you are doing the standard. So if now suddenly there is an issue with the standard, how do we work with that? What's really the right way for those who set standards and those who provide the certification to respond to some of those issues? And this is something that we were grappling with this year. And I would just want to say, I like to think that we are forward-looking and Kantara, and there were some bad things in the press, and yet the good that I think that has come out of that is to highlight issues, to be able to say to the standard setter like NIST, you need to address some of this. You need to think about this. If this standard isn't working the way it is, what do we need to do to make it better? And we're having those same discussions inside of Kantara because that then plays out in our certification programs. And we really want to be thinking about, okay, so this, at the moment, in some ways, we're like what judges often say, well, I can only deal with the law that's in front of me, right? So we can only deal with the standard in front of us, and it is what it is. But that said, it's an opportunity for us to look forward and figure out, okay, but where do we need to go from here? And what will make this better? And who are the partners that we need to have come together to address it in a way that actually makes an improvement?
Yeah, and I think building on that, as you do go forward and you do look forward, what are the levers that can be pulled that encourage trust? I've covered choice as one of them. I think there's another one around transparency and user control. So is it clear where you're getting, how the verification is actually happening? Is it clear where data is coming from? Is it clear what users can do to actually control their data, deleting accounts, opting out, et cetera? And so, obviously, just like everybody else in this room, we're pretty eagerly anticipating what's going to be in the 863.4. And I think the word that we're hearing is that they're going to cover, lots of different territory on some of these topics. And so, from this standpoint, I think identifying what those levers are that can encourage trust and figuring out how we can move towards them as an ecosystem, I think is going to be really important.
And then the last question that we pose is really about how do we maximize the role that certification bodies and trust frameworks can really play in building trust with the consumers or with the users. One thing I will tell you, I mentioned to you that Kantara has a certification program both in the US and the UK. The other thing that we do is we actually convene a group, I host a group of government professionals, government employees from a variety of countries, not just the UK and the US. Canada's there, Australia, New Zealand, the list goes on, right? So we all come together. And what's interesting is that clearly the world has gotten smaller. It's clearly these are global issues, right? And so they actually asked, the last meeting that I had for them just a couple of weeks ago, they specifically asked for me to bring in someone from NIST, which I did, to talk about how are you addressing all of these issues in version 4? Because we need to know what we should be doing or thinking about. And I think what they're looking to, and they're looking to Kantara for this as well, is you're the thought leaders in this. So have you thought this through? We're grappling with it, and we want to learn from each other, very much the way that you all have come together to learn from each other here as well. As you can see, the fluidity of trust, in some ways, what we're talking about is very intangible, and it can be really hard to get your arms around that. And yet, it's really critical and really underpins, I think, the whole system. So, as I mentioned, we see this as part of relations, and those relationships happen in a variety of ways, verticals, horizontal, all different ways, and they happen globally. And it happens in the context. We've had some specific circumstances that have happened. There will be more. This is likely not, the only crisis the identity industry will ever face. So it's good for us to be figuring out, how do we resolve this? How do we come together? How do we do things that are forward-looking and make a huge difference? And we see this trust evolving over time and in a positive way. So at this point, we've posed some of our questions. We would like to open it to you. We have 3 minutes. Yes, sir.
Maybe not a question, but maybe you could elaborate on it as I see it from the outside. So the standard for identity proofing calls for biometrics.
Right.
And you implement the standard and the government says, no, we take it back, and it's moved away from the standard. So now there's a ambiguous, what's the future of the standard? If the government's not adopting its own standard, what's the use case for business complying with a standard that the government themselves don't use? And then in addition, I think this is for ID&E, was this a reasonable rationalization, considering that identity proofing and selfies are pretty much the rule of thumb in KYC and digital account opening scenarios as well too. What are the standards for those organizations? Because they're still doing it, and it seems to be that if you want to open up a bank account, you really still have the same choice. You either go in and present yourself, or you do it remote. So I'm curious where that leaves you as an organization in terms of what's the advice for people that are out there building selfie-based attestation models into their workflow.
Do you want to answer the first one, or should I go first?
I'll go first.
Okay.
And then you. So just a couple things. Yes, we have seen these statements made in a variety of places by federal government agencies, most of whom are higher level and are not boots on the ground. And I would tell you that that doesn't necessarily mean that that practice has suddenly disappeared and we're no longer doing any kind of selfie, in part because they're dealing with government dollars, my taxpayer dollars, and so they should be fighting fraud. It's very hard to fight fraud if all I'm going to do is a little self-attestation. Oh, trust me, in the dark, you can't see me, but I am who I say I am. I mean, look what Rachel did, really? So there's sort of the rhetoric that we hear, and then there's the practicality. Now, that said, I think that this has put tremendous pressure on NIST and the federal government to, pull the trigger, make a decision, decide what this standard needs to be. And if this isn't working, then let's find a way to make it better. But we can't just say, oh, from now on, it's all just going to be self-attestation. That makes no sense, right? We still have to combat fraud. We still have to mitigate risk. All of those things are still there. So there's a lot of rhetoric that I'm not sure is getting translated into changes in practice. I think, and what I hope, because I'm talking with NIST every week, to be honest. So what we hope is that they'll find ways to help us encourage innovation in the marketplace. And so I would encourage those of you in the field to still be looking at innovations, listen to the rhetoric, understand, a little bit about what people are saying, and yet think about what's the practicality, because fraud and all of that is not going away. So we have to find a way to do this. And I just think it's a challenge for everyone, and it's a challenge for the feds, but I'm not sure the answer is to abandon it. Anyway, that's my personal opinion, obviously.
I totally support that opinion, and I think, where the dialogue going is, responsible use, because there is a certain practicality to, having a phone in your pocket or, having a webcam on your laptop. And so it is a very straightforward biometric tool to use, in the verification process. But I think making sure we're using it responsibly, making sure performance is measured and assessed and how it affects different people, I think that's a conversation that needs to be had. It needs to be had with data and facts. But, we are in the very unique position is now that we do offer consumers choice and we can see what they're choosing when they come to us, either go down the path with a selfie or go straight to a video agent. And we can see it at different levels of wait times to actually see agents. And I won't share specific numbers today, but when I look at them, I see that Americans clearly value speed and convenience and are willing to give up a little bit of information over a short time period in return for speed and convenience. And we were expecting to see a high number, but even we were surprised by just how large the majority is of people who are choosing that self-serve pathway.
Right. I would love to continue this dialogue, but I'm pretty sure that we're already over time, and I know there's another session. Thank you all. I really appreciate you participating, and we look forward to having more conversations about these.